Like so many others, the Hermit's Peak Watershed Alliance jumped into action after the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire to do what we could to reduce immediate impacts. Grass seed and cover crops were planted, soils were stabilized, and new erosion problems were arrested. Now, after a year of reflection and experience and hard work by many others, this video series was conceived. These videos offer very practical post-fire restoration techniques and instructions that are even helpful in normal times. So far, the list consists of 1. This introduction and an explanation of fire effects on watershed health. 2. The critical roles of plants in watershed health and restoring herbaceous vegetation after fire. 3. Water drainage restoration with low-tech, process-based techniques. 4. The roles of floodplains in flood mitigation and their restoration. 5. Upland erosion control. 6. Restoring trees and shrubs. Let's start by describing the effects of fire on watershed health. Because every element of a watershed is connected to the others, the effects of fire on the parts of a watershed are interrelated. In this video, we'll describe the effects of fire on the function of watershed elements and touch on some of the interrelationships. Watersheds are made up of the climate, such as precipitation, temperature, and wind. Rocks, soil, topography, plants, animals, and people, all connected by a common water source. Fire affects all these elements and their relationship to each other. The most striking and immediate effect of fire is the loss of vegetation. This and direct heat then significantly change the soil and how it works to carry water throughout the landscape. Loss of vegetation and changes to the soil cause a cascade of effects that impact the movement, quantity, and quality of water in the burned areas, as well as long distances downstream.
The Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire of summer 2022 was a terrible happening. It was New Mexico's largest forest fire in its state history at over 341,000 acres. It affected so many people, so many places, and so many aspects of our watersheds that we depend upon and that we love. I personally was impacted in the very early days of the prescribed burn going out of control. I mean, Hermit's Peak was an area that I've mapped, I've worked in for a long time with students, whether it was geology, soil, or water projects, engaging students in those studies and propelling them in their early careers. When a fire goes through a watershed, it can have a number of deleterious effects. They can induce hillside erosion, and that erosive material makes its way into the waterways, and it can increase sedimentation and decrease the clarity of those streams. Forest fires can increase the velocity and volumes of water that's entering into the streams, and a whole change of the hydrologic network or that drainage network. And those floods can be very, very damaging to homes and people. Forest fires can also affect wildlife, and all of the forests, the vegetation, the riparian corridors can impact aquatic species and wildlife that depend on those corridors. Fires in watersheds can also severely impact water quality. And oftentimes, as an environmental geologist, we're looking at water quality in terms of the ecosystems and the services they provide. The Guyanas River is designated as a high-quality cold water fishery. So we think about the loss of the forest can take away that thermal cover. It can increase temperature. It can decrease the amount of dissolved oxygen that's available to aquatic species. We also think about water quality, like I said earlier, about the amount of sediment that's in the water, the turbidity, the suspended solids, the dissolved solids, and more can impact that high-quality cold water designation. We also think too about watersheds that support communities and their drinking water supplies, and that was absolutely the case for the city of Las Vegas. The city of Las Vegas gets, I think, 85% or more of its drinking water supplies from the Guyanas River, coming from the Guyanas watershed. So when that watershed's impacted by fire, it's going to impact the cost for pre-treatment, the silting up of reservoirs, and any other kind of emergency responses that are necessary. The loss of vegetation from a fire can severely impact the functioning of a watershed. Trees, vegetation, and a stable soil structure support the microorganisms in the soil. They slow the flow of water into a stream, and they also support healthy infiltration into the subsurface. Without that, you're going to have more overland flow and directly sluicing into a river. You're going to have the degradation of that organic cover that used to act like a sponge and is now disappeared. You're going to be carrying silt and sediment and ash and other kind of charred debris into the water, causing different kinds of black water events. And sometimes some of the things that are carried in are natural. Some of the things can be anthropogenic or human contaminants. Maybe it's the retardants that were being used to put out the fires. Maybe they're just some of the oil, some of the amendments that are put onto fields or used around a home property. With the increase in flow that comes when you've lost the vegetation, you can also find a submerging of wellheads. And with that, you can sometimes contaminate some of our groundwater supplies with different types of enteric microorganisms. All of these things can be short-lived or long-lived depending on the severity of the fire and the impacts to the watershed functions.
There's several impacts to fire with the loss of vegetation, but also, so one of the impacts being a loss of shade. When there's less shade on the ground, that soil is now being heated more often and directly exposed to the sun, where it once had trees and the shade to cover those spots. That soil being more exposed to sun has lower soil moisture content and is now drier. The other impact that a lack of shade could have is during the winter time when snowfall is coming in the higher parts of the watershed. So at the top of the watershed, most of the water coming in for that area is actually precipitation is received as snowfall rather than rainfall, which is more common at the lower elevations. So the lack of shade on snowfall has an impact on how that snow is eventually sublimating, which is wind blowing across the snow and then that snow is evaporating, or how that snow is melting. When areas with more trees and more shade, that snow is slower to melt. So the largest impact of the lack of shade over time will be how long the snow actually stays in our upper watershed, meaning that later we may see runoff that occurs sooner in the spring because that snow is melting sooner without the shade to cover it. So the loss of infiltration in a watershed is critical to how the watershed functions. So a loss of infiltration means you've lost organic matter in the soil and you've lost the soil's capacity to infiltrate the water precipitation, whether that be rain or snow as it's coming in, into the ground. The loss of infiltration means that you will now have runoff that's occurring as surface runoff and overland or sheet flow across the watershed. For example, when you get a rainfall event that's super intense or very high intensity, meaning let's say an inch per hour or more than that, then you would, instead of having rain infiltrate into the soil, you're actually going to have, with the loss of infiltration, that entire 1-inch rainstorm, if it occurs in 15 minutes or an hour, is going to be running off now down into the streams below. So that 1 inch per hour or rainstorm versus a 1 inch over 15-minute rainstorm, the difference will be when you see that peak flow in the flood down below. So with a 1 inch per 15-minute rainstorm, and that occurs for an hour, meaning 4 inches in an hour, you're actually going to have quite a large peak flow below because very little of it is able to infiltrate, impacting and causing larger flood stages downstream. Slower rainstorms may be able to infiltrate upstream, but with the loss of infiltration and/or hydrophobic soils, you're getting a lot less precipitation that's able to infiltrate and more runoff downstream. It just may occur a little bit later, depending on the intensity of the rainstorm.
Hydrophobicity in its strictest terms just means fear of water. When we talk about it in terms of the change in a soil structure after a fire, we're talking about that tendency of the soil to repel water. That tendency to repel water can result from a variety of conditions of the fire. Sometimes it's the burning of organic matter that creates a waxy substance that is repellent. Sometimes it's all of the fine ash itself that is laying on the surface and clogs the pore spaces in the soils. But that repellency, that tendency to impede infiltration of water, can be so detrimental to healthy soils. You're not going to have that soil moisture, you're not going to have that infiltration, you're not going to have that recharging of shallow and even deeper groundwater systems. You're not going to have that maintenance of those wetlands that are so important to healthy watersheds.
In a healthy watershed, think about soils having layers. In a healthy watershed, at the top and at the surface, we can see the grasses, the shrubs, the trees, dead organic material like dead logs, breaking down and living on top of the soils. Below the surface, there's actually very complex structure of roots and organic material and decomposed material and organisms such as funguses and bugs and maybe other animals that live underneath the surface. All of those complexities in that system are helping the watershed function and improving infiltration into the surface. After a wildfire, depending on the severity of the fire, there could be impacts to what happens at the subsurface. At a higher level, after a fire, the scorching of the material into the soils actually can burn out the organic material at the top, including a lot of the roots, so the grasses are gone after a fire, the shrubs may be gone, and some of the trees may be gone. Well, when those things burn, the roots that they had living into the ground, they may also burn all the way down into a stump hole, which you would see in the fire. So that may occur several feet deep into the ground. So there's a loss of organic material, and in that soil matrix eliminates the complexity of that system. And with hydrophobic soils that may have formed at the soil surface, preventing water flow into the soils below, that life underneath is impacted.
A forested watershed, or the forests themselves, they kind of act like a sponge. They themselves are a form of flood control. The branches, the needles, the twigs, the leaves, they all help to intercept water. The roots help to infiltrate water and slow any of that rain. In a healthy forest, you're going to see a lag time between a precipitation event and a high on a hydrograph, the way that scientists measure the volume of water flowing past a gauging instrument in a stream. After a fire, without the forest and the vegetation and that healthy soil structure, you're just going to have a quickening of the water as it enters into the stream system. You're not going to have any kind of mitigation effects when it comes to raindrops themselves. Every single raindrop, especially in heavy rain events, can dislodge soil particles and mobilize them. Imagine that with all of the raindrops as they fall on this barren landscape full of ash and full of charred material. It's going to exacerbate erosion. You start to see rills form and gullies form, and with each of those they get deeper, they get more widespread and facilitate erosion. In post-fire environments, it's difficult for systems to recharge aquifers if that hydrophobicity or that water repellency has developed. With that water repellency, you're just not going to get that infiltration. You're just not going to have that movement of water vertically into the subsurface. Also, without all that forest cover to help to keep things shaded, keep things cool, and have that natural moist cover, you're going to have more evaporation and just a drying of the slopes. All of those forested hillsides will take years to recover, and then that recharging of the aquifer and that return to an equilibrium between groundwater and surface water flow.
Yeah, the Trout Springs is one of the crown jewels of natural aquifers in northern New Mexico. It consistently runs at 1 cubic feet per second, about 500,000 gallons per day come out of the Trout Springs. We were very, very worried that there would be an issue there. It is a seep spring from somewhere up top of the mountain. It doesn't appear that it got severely burnt to where it's not seeping, which is great. It's still running very consistently. We did have the water tested and the water quality is very good. So that was something we were really, really worried about, particularly because that's our water source for the ranch. It has been recharging like normal. That is what's so miraculous about the Trout Springs, is that in the worst drought conditions, you know, it runs a little faster when we're getting a lot of the rain, or more output when we're getting a lot of rain for sure. But that thing just keeps pumping out consistently for as long as I've lived and as long as we've owned this ranch for 125 years.
In a healthy watershed, forests, vegetation, and intact soil structures help to maintain slow, steady runoff after precipitation events into our streams, and they also help to support slow, steady infiltration of precipitation and snowmelt throughout the year. You can sometimes equate what happens to a watershed after a fire to almost that process of urbanization, putting down impermeable surfaces like driveways and buildings and such. We've now made a watershed basically water repellent, so you're going to have a more rapid overland flow or surface flow of water instead of that nice, steady infiltration. It's going to overcome the small drainages, it's going to overcome the larger system. We're going to have higher peak flows and a shorter lag time between the precipitation event and those high flows. You'll have higher flood events and a lessening of base flow, and that base flow is subsequent to the rain events. One of the things that, you know, it's still too immediate to see, but we've seen it in other fires throughout the U.S. Southwest, is the change in base flow. Base flow is groundwater. It's separate from surface water flow. It's groundwater that takes a long time and a long delay in the system. But it's that base flow that supports our streams during the summer months absent a monsoon, or during the fall and the winter absent any precipitation. With the heavy volumes and the heavy velocities and the channel incision and the loss of that floodplain connectivity, if we're not recharging our shallow and deeper aquifers, we're going to see that loss in base flow. And that base flow is so critical to the issuing of so many springs that are important to us throughout our mountainsides. And it's important to many of us who value some of our systems like the Montezuma Hot Springs. They are fed by that base flow. If we don't return the watershed to its natural, healthy conditions, we may see a loss of those and other culturally important waters.
All of the loss of vegetation, soil changes, and erosion that happens in a post-fire environment contribute to the stream channel changes with negative consequences to water quantity and availability. The changes are related to stream geomorphology or the shape of the streams.
After a forest fire, it's known that stream flows are higher, the volumes, the velocities, and they can greatly impact the erosive capacity of the waters that fall on those landscapes. With that increased erosive capacity, we see a change in the channel heads Channel heads are kind of that inflection point on a hillside where you go from hill slope to channel bottom or channel flow. We'll start to see higher rates of incision and a migration of those channel heads upstream. We'll see a deepening or a greater incisement of those channels. So that all disconnects those streams with the floodplains that were those natural processes of 1 to 2 year floods. It changes those whole hydrodynamics, and it changes what used to be natural meandering streams into those deep, straight, simple geometries. Simple geometries, not good. We want complex geometries where you have cut banks and point bars, where you have different flow regimes at any point in your stream. With these simple geometries and that migration of the channel head and those deeper incisements, it all can cause long-term effects on stream hydrology.
Rapid stream flows, upland erosion, stream incision, and disconnection of a stream with its floodplain reduces recharge of the groundwater and in the base flow, which lowers the water table, making water less available in the soil to grow plants.
After fire events, that blackening of the water or those black water events are very common. You no longer have stable soil structures. You don't have that soil mass intact. It's often loose, it's often granular, and it's often highly susceptible to erosion. Any kind of precipitation event, low, medium, or high, are going to mobilize that material and take it into our tributaries and take that into our streams. And that's a bad thing. A lot of our salmonids, a lot of insects, a lot of aquatic species require cool, clarified waters to thrive. The turbidity and all of the material that's washed into the streams, like nitrates, phosphates, carbon, ash, they can induce different kinds of algal blooms that can too decrease the amount of dissolved oxygen that's available for fish. Fish want to breathe. Fish need an amount of dissolved oxygen, and they don't want that ash and slurry to clog up their gills and hurt their ability to thrive. We know too that a lot of those ash particles have a type of shape and size that attracts different kinds of metals, different kinds of debris, different kinds of things that they can carry into a stream, like enteric microorganisms. It's also a bad thing because it can choke the stream. It can overcome that stream's sediment carrying capacity, and you'll start to have more deposition of sediment, leading to aggradation or growth of the channel beds and flooding across the countryside. It's also going to be really bad when it comes to cities like the city of Las Vegas that depend greatly on the Guyanas River and the areas that were impacted by the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire for their drinking water supplies. With high amounts of sedimentation, it overloads the system, and it's pre-treatment of those waters to get out the suspended solids and to bring it to drinking water quality. It's expensive, requires interaction, and in many cases, including Las Vegas, it requires additional instrumentation.
So after a wildfire, the increased amount of runoff and flooding that's occurring has a very high likelihood to impact domestic wells. And this impact could come in the form of the sheet flow actually eroding below the well pad, and then that flow going down the well, getting into the well that way. This sheet flow, and from a water quality standpoint, where the flooding has impacted wells, could potentially result in higher nitrates or higher presence of E. coli in a domestic well. The New Mexico Environment Department offers free domestic well testing through the Groundwater Quality Bureau, and is always able to test domestic wells for any landowners with concerns that their wells have been impacted as a result of the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire. Post-fire runoff is okay to use for irrigating crops post-fire. That said, when the water is at its ashiest and muddiest, if you can not use it from the perspective of adding a ton of sediment to your crops, that may be easier. That's from a more debris perspective as opposed to a water quality perspective. From a water quality perspective, the water post-fire runoff is okay to use to water your crops. It's also okay for livestock watering. The main concern for watering livestock post-fire with post-fire runoff is radionuclides. Last summer, the New Mexico Environment Department tested turbid waters in July of 2022 to see if the water was acceptable for livestock consumption, which is one of the designated uses of the streams, for example, the Mora River and the Gallinas River in the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire area. Those results did indicate that the water was safe for livestock drinking.
Different kinds of activities that the Hermit's Peak Watershed Alliance has been doing, for all of its existence, but in particularly post-fire, are just so important in restoring, maintaining, and protecting the health of the Gallinas, the Sapeo, and the Mora watersheds. The different activities like building one-rock dams, like putting down the hay bales, like putting in some of the riffles, all of that serves to slow the flow of water, dissipate the energy, spread the water out so you can have more infiltration of water, more of that communication of surface water and groundwater, recharge of the shallow aquifers, and just that support of the healthy riparian communities.
The effects of the fire in the upper watershed has the potential to impact from widespread flooding and sediment deposits and debris deposits for many, many miles downstream. In the case of Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon, there were effects seen all the way down to Santa Rosa Lake, where the Pecos River dumps in.
The flooding has been pretty intense last year. We haven't had any this year, but last year it was intense. We feel very lucky because we are downstream from a lot of the work that Hermit's Peak Watershed Alliance did up by the firehouse, reintroducing the floodplain and helping spread out the water. The initial work was done in 2013 after a 100-year flood. It wasn't until last year that you could really see how that work was spreading out the floodplain so that it really took the pressure off of the stream coming down and absolutely saved one of our bridges that's upstream.
Yeah, so there's a whole ton of structures we can use. The one that we're sitting on right now, this is a one-rock dam. It's clearly more than one rock, but the one rock just refers to height, so how tall it is. So this is just a bunch of rocks book stacked next to each other, and then it kind of slopes back down upstream. We have baffles, so we use that when we want the water to hit the other bank and kind of scour it out, take some of that soil, and then hopefully deposit it in the slow side, on the opposite side. You can use that to add some sinuosity to a stream. You can use that just to slow water down. We have done some log step downs, which is essentially making a log staircase for the water to come down. We use that specifically to stop head cuts from developing any further. You can do really simple structures like rock rundowns, which is literally just a bunch of rocks downstream. That serves a pretty similar purpose to the one rock dam. You can do Zuni bowls, which essentially is going to be a big bowl made out of rock. Pretty similar purpose to the one rock dam. You want to slow that water down. You want to keep head cuts or any sort of slope from developing any further. And then you can do media lunas. Media lunas you can do, they're essentially a big arch of rocks on the ground. So they kind of come out in a U shape. And you can use those for a couple of different purposes. You can use it to either spread water out, or you can actually use it to focus water to a specific point. So if you want to try and protect something over there, you can focus it somewhere else. We also use trash racks. Those, you're not really trying to stop the water so much, but you are trying to collect a lot of debris that's going to be coming downstream. You want to hold that in the channel if you can. That organic material does a lot. It can help keep water cool over the top. It can provide habitat. It'll decompose into nutrients. This summer we did do a week doing BDAs, which are beaver dam analogs, which, amazing. It's crazy how effective those things are. It's essentially going in and you building a sort of, you can think of it as a speed hump in the water. And what you're trying to do is raise that water as high as you can. And you can do, we were raising the water, you know, 1.5 to 2 feet in spots. It's crazy how effective it is. So yeah, you know, in a post-fire situation, these are really simple tools that people can learn very quickly that have really serious impacts and can actually really work really quickly. We have some one rock dams that we put out a couple of weeks ago that are topped already with soil. You can't even see them. So, you know, these processes work really quickly. And if you time it right, you don't want to seed right before rain, that kind of stuff. You know, if you really work out some of the basics, you can have really big impacts with small numbers of people on property. You know, and if you have property out here with water, you want to protect that as much as possible. You know.
The aftermath of a wildfire significantly impacts a watershed, causing notable environmental changes such as accelerated erosion, incision, altered water quality, and sediment buildup. Understanding these transformations is crucial for collaborative efforts aimed at healing and preventing further degradation of the watershed. The ongoing work by organizations like Hermit's Peak Watershed Alliance plays a vital role in addressing immediate threats like debris accumulation and erosion, as well as ensuring the long-term health of the watershed, protecting it for future generations.